captioning, you can do so with this show subtitle button here. And we wish to acknowledge the history of the lands on which we are each living. Canada is home to many different Indigenous peoples. We ask that you each take a moment to research, learn about, and reflect upon the Indigenous people whose lands you are currently on. TSPN resides on the Greater Toronto Area. We are located on the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And this territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. It is now home to many diverse nations, diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And I'll just also remind you quickly that we have a strict no harassment policy at our events as well. So first of all, I'll just tell you a little bit more about TSPN. So my name is Dawn. I am an executive member of the Toronto Science Policy Network, and we are a student-run science policy group based out of the University of Toronto. And we are open to all disciplines and are inclusive of all research areas. And our goal is to provide a platform for students and postdocs to learn more about and engage in science policy. And we also work with the community to advocate for evidence behind for evidence-based policy and to promote discussion on the science behind key policies. And we do all of this through our workshops, like what you're here for today. We have talks, panels, and also campaigns. And so some of you attended our first workshop in our Research at Work series, but many of you are attending for the first time today as well. So basically the goal of this workshop series is to teach you about the basics of science policy and connect you with experts in this space. So part of what we're trying to answer are these three questions here. So what is science policy? Where does science policy fit in with other forms of science translation? And you can be thinking about where do I fit into this space as well? So we've built, TSPN built a map of science translation space to try to help answer these questions and to kind of make clear how some of these people and pathways are interacting. So what we have here is this pathway going from scientific research that is conducted to its implementation. So it to being used in some form by people. And a few of the main ways that this occurs are shown. So we have the evidence being communicated to three main groups here: the scientific community, the public, or policymakers. And the results of this are contributions to the scientific body of knowledge, to public knowledge, to technology that can be used, and to policy. And in all of these cases, we can have direct implementation of these things. So people actually using this evidence or these new tools to make the decisions in their work and their lives. We've also included a few of the processes that are involved in all of these pathways as well. So the steps or the tools that are actually kind of being undertaken to move from research to actual practical use. And really importantly, in all of these four components of knowledge translation actually loop back and inform what kind of research is conducted next. So what we know scientifically can inform what the next questions we're going to ask may be. What the public is interested in and what they care about can contribute to what we study. The technology, the tools that we have available define what research will be done as well. And also this last pathway here of how policy informs scientific research is an important one at the science policy interface as well. So that one's broken down a little bit further. And this term of science policy can be kind of defined as this policy for science and science for policy loop, this cycle shown at the bottom. But really importantly, all of these other pathways as well are interacting, and all of the various people engaged along the way are interacting and communicating with each other as well. So this kind of led us to break down what we thought are the three really important kind of fundamental pathways at the science policy interface. So we have this one box at the top, which is science communication to the public in the form of information. And that's what the focus of today's workshop is going to be on, how we actually communicate this research to people to result in public knowledge. And the two pathways at the bottom there are scientific research to policymakers to inform policy, and then the loop back of policy for science. So these are the three workshops, like I said, in our Research at Work workshop series. And we had the first one a week and a half ago on policy for science. And today we're focusing on this one here, science and the public. The next workshop we'll have, which we hope you also attend, is science for policy. So now going a little bit deeper into this pathway of science communication and the public. So some of the processes that may be involved here are science journalism, so reporting about science to the public, science outreach, promoting public awareness of science. These can be efforts targeted to specific populations or focus on specific topics, and then also science education. And here we're thinking about kind of education of the public to increase science literacy. And a few avenues that are involved in these processes are included here as well. So we have broadcast media, so radio, TV, documentaries, print media like newspapers or journals, and social media. And this one has kind of really opened up this space for a lot more people to be involved in this process as well. We also have informal education. So these could be things like museums or community projects, and formal education like in school, that are all different mechanisms that contribute to how science is communicated with the public. And in any of these cases, what is communicated with the public results in this public knowledge, and which really holds a lot of power and is really incredibly important in shaping society, because not only are people using it to make decisions about their lives, but they're also making decisions that kind of affect society more broadly. So through things like voting, they're really influencing that policymakers and policy piece of the map too. So we have a lot of interconnectedness, and we think it's really important that this pathway be well understood. And one more important thing I'll say is that there are a lot of different people and groups involved here as well. So it's definitely not just scientists communicating their science. We have all these different groups, the media, advocacy organizations, government agencies, a lot of different people that are really connected in these processes as well. And there should be kind of arrows going in all directions for the different types of communications that happen here. And you'll see in the case examples later on, some really interesting kind of communications between some of these groups here. So what are the actual goals of science communication? So according to a report by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in the US, the following 5 main goals were identified. So science communication can have the goal of just sharing recent findings in science, or increasing public appreciation for science. It can also have the goal of increasing knowledge and understanding of the science on specific issues that may require a decision. So the public may need to be more informed and educated about a topic so they can make decisions about it. Another goal could be to influence people's opinions, behavior, and policy preferences when there is solid evidence showing that there's like an important consequence to society. So for something like public health. And finally, science communication can be aimed at engaging with diverse groups to ensure that the various perspectives are considered when it comes to important issues that impact society. And there are also many challenges in science communication and in this interaction between sort of the science and the public. And 2 of the main ones are shown here. So this first one is sharing difficult information or bad news. And of course, not all science is exciting, happy new discoveries. Some is scary and confusing and can be really hard to wrap your head around. So it's very important sort of that we still get these scientific concepts and information across. So this is an important challenge to consider. And the other one is this idea of misinformation or disinformation. So information that's being communicated incorrectly, either accidentally or on purpose, but this misinformation can make its way around, create confusion, and this is a big challenge in science communication as well. So these are really important topics to consider when thinking about science in the public, and our speakers today understand these very well, and they deal with these a lot in their work. So they're going to be sharing some excellent examples of this and kind of helping us work through how to understand some of this and consider these things when thinking about science communication. So with that, I will introduce our amazing speakers. We are very pleased to have with us today Amanda Buckowitz and Senator Stan Kuchar. So Amanda is an award-winning science journalist who is currently a producer at CBC Radio's iconic science show, Quirks and Quirks. After studying journalism, she started her career at Discovery Channel's Daily Planet, where she traveled the world producing stories on a variety of topics. And she has also produced several documentary series. And now at Quirks and Quirks, she focuses her work on stories that highlight how awesome our planet can be, and shining the light on difficult topics like the effects of racism and colonialism in the world of science. And Senator Stan Kuchar is an internationally renowned psychiatrist in adolescent mental health, and he is a leader in mental health research, education, advocacy, policy, and services innovation. His work has led to the development of a national child and youth mental health framework for Canada, and he has conducted award-winning research into the neurobiology and treatments of mental disorders in youth. Recently, his focus was on primary care mental health interventions and mental health literacy development, and ensuring the best available evidence is used to advance mental health and enable rapid access to effective mental health care is essential to Senator Kuchar's initiatives. So thank you both so much for joining us today. We are very grateful to have you here to discuss the topic of science in the public and getting the real story out there. So we will start with short talks from each of you. And so first I'll pass it off to Amanda.
Excellent. Hi, everybody. Yeah, as Dawn has already said, I'm a producer over at Quirks and Quarks on CBC Radio. I'm not a scientist. I'm just a journalist who focuses on science. And I kind of got into this just because I'm a curious person who just really loves understanding how the world works. And I really like telling stories about what cool stuff scientists are up to. Just because I was raised by an engineer father and a nurse mother. And so I always had questions and they always had answers. And I loved that. I loved knowing, our health, our food, the air that we breathe, all this stuff. I loved having answers and being able to figure all that stuff out. I also love the scientific process of, we don't have the answer for this. Let's figure this out. Let's actually do experiments and do a bunch of tests and try and figure everything out. So I always thought that was really, really cool about the process of science. And like Dawn said, I almost went into medicine, but it didn't vibe with me. I didn't want my day-to-day life to be a life and death situation. And so I instead decided to just keep telling the world about all the cool stuff that I was finding out. Because one thing about journalism is you can kind of end up here through many different ways. Some people start out as scientists and then they move over to journalism. Some, like me, just start out as journalists and then shimmy on over to mostly talking about science. Some of us have PhDs, some of us haven't even graduated high school. What you really need in order to be a journalist is curiosity and to be articulate and to be able to see things from multiple angles and be able to kind of put it all together and communicate that really clearly. So I went to Ryerson's journalism school and I kind of just did a very broad education there. And then I focused on broadcast because I thought that was really interesting. And this was when social media was kind of just starting to bubble up and I was seeing all the different ways that people were communicating things. And so I focused a lot on radio because I thought it was interesting, but there were no jobs in that. So I then turned into TV. So after graduating, I spent a very good amount of time doing a whole bunch of unpaid internships while working upwards of 3 jobs to pay the bills. I do not recommend that. But eventually I ended up getting a job as a researcher at Discovery Channel's daily science show, Daily Planet. And I was very hungry to keep that job because it was kind of a dream place to work at the time. And I didn't want to go back to the unpaid internship life. And so I spent a lot of my first few years there just going around and sitting down and talking to people and just sitting down with them and saying, okay, what's the secret? How do you do what you do? Like, what is the key to doing this job? And so I'd like to share some of the advice that I got with you guys. The first piece of advice that I got was to listen. Just listen, listen, listen. If you're talking more than you're listening, then you're doing a bad job. Because science is about going very deep into a very specific thing, but science journalism is about going very deep into a very broad thing. So we need to be listening to different perspectives. We need to be listening to the facts and information behind these perspectives to see where they came from. And we also need to be listening extra hard to hear what isn't being said and listen for those voices that aren't being heard when they should be brought to the table. Another piece of advice that I got was to consider my audience. A radio audience is different from a TV audience, just like a Vice podcast audience is different from a CBC national radio show audience. And writing something for a group of scientists is very different than writing something for families to listen to on their Saturday morning drives to the cottage. So you have to know how to reach people where they are. And I don't like the term dumbing it down, so I won't use it, but I much prefer the term keep it simple, stupid, which is KISS. So just tell people what's interesting to them. Don't overcomplicate things. Just keep it simple. But the best piece of advice that I got was that this job is ultimately about telling stories. People absorb information through stories, not just facts being blasted their way. If you think back, like Indigenous legends, folk tales, and even Marvel movies, all of those are driven by stories, and that's how we pass on information. And so if you want people to care about a recent study involving population declines in grizzly bears, tell them a story about how the researcher involved trekked through the bush for hours without seeing a single bear. If you want people to care about COVID, tell them the story of the nurses on the front lines. So thanks to these lessons and countless others, I set out to do that in my career. And after spending 7 years at Discovery Channel, working my way up to chase producer and then segment producer, I went freelance. I produced and directed a bunch of different nature documentaries, history shows, podcasts, and then ended up where I am right now. I'm still learning. I'm always learning, but the fundamentals stay the same. Just listen, think of your audience, and remember that you are first and foremost a storyteller. Anyways, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting. I think hearing your career path, super interesting. And also this idea of stories is something we all need to be reminded about, not just facts. All right, I will pass it off to Senator Kuchar.
Thank you very much, Dawn. And thank you everyone for being here this afternoon and letting me join you. I'm coming to you from the Algonquin Anishinaabe unceded territory in the city of Ottawa, and I'm looking out my window at West Block and Center Block. So it's a real privilege to actually be sitting here. And it's wonderful, Amanda, to hear you speak. You produce one of my favorite shows, period, in the world. And if I miss a Saturday listening to Quirks and Quarks, I feel my Saturday has not been what it should be. So those of you who aren't listening every week, please listen. It's outstanding. I learned so much from it. So thank you so much for doing that. But you know what? Most people don't listen to the CBC. And this is one of the things that while there are just outstanding places to go to, like the work that Amanda does, or the work that Joe Schwartz does at McGill, the McGill work group, most Canadians don't go there. So the challenge that what we need to think about here is how do we get to everybody who's not on this on the Zoom call, because that's where our customers, our audience really is. Our audience is the people that don't listen to us. And in social media terms, it's our audience is the people who are outside of our bubbles, because that's the people that we really need to reach. When we just talk to each other as scientists, as science communicators, we're singing to the choir. So the first thing I'm going to put on the table for us as a challenge is are we reaching the people that are out who are not like us? And then and as Amanda said, the story is so important. I'm going to just add, are we reaching people who aren't like us, but also who receive information in different ways than we receive information? So as an Indigenous person living in rural Manitoba, receiving important science-based information in the way that they understand it and can apply it in their lives, is a racialized mother of many children who works in a long-term care facility and is therefore exposed to COVID and is making minimal wage. Is that the same person as one of us who's sitting at a university classroom? So those are the issues. Amanda said, know your audience. She's absolutely right. But also we have to be proactive in identifying the audience and saying the stories that we need to say in a way that resonates with the audience, that the audience sees themselves in, that the audience is comfortable in, and that the audience can then integrate the scientific information that they need to have in order to live healthier and more productive lives, because that's the purpose of the information. We all often forget that. It's interesting to know just on the basis of knowledge alone. I mean, I love learning about black holes, but really black holes don't influence my life. It's just because I like learning about them. But it's so important for people to have the scientifically based knowledge and understanding so that they can use that to make their lives better. So I'm going to raise the issue here of scientific literacy, because basically that's, I think, where we're starting. And scientific literacy to me is the foundation for health literacy and mental health literacy, which are then the foundational blocks for for creating health. Not to discount the social determinants of health at all, absolutely essential. But with even in areas of poor social determinants, people who have really good health literacy do way better in their health outcomes than people who have poor health literacy. And if one thing COVID has shown us is how abysmal our health literacy is in Canada, and how problematic it is, and how challenging it is to bring good health literacy, which is good science literacy, to people. My background, I came out of a PhD program in history of all things, and went into medical school, and eventually ended up in neuroscience, psychiatry, and youth mental health, and then realized that there was a whole world out there, and began to work with people in other countries, with the World Health Organization, the Pan American Health Organization, became the Associate Dean of International Health at Dalhousie Medical School, and uh, then move my work into the school system, because realizing that if we didn't build the capacity right from an early age on, and whether this is mental, and my areas with mental health literacy, but this is health literacy and science literacy. If we don't create our educational systems that embed the scientific literacy, thinking like a scientist, into the earliest years, and then reinforcing it over time, we end up with a population that is not as scientifically literate as it could be, and then therefore doesn't use the tools that science brings to help the organization, to help themselves in their lives or their families' lives. I'm currently very privileged to be in the Canadian Senate. It's an incredible honor to be there, and an incredible amount of work, because I as as a scientist and as a physician, it was really important for me to understand how people could receive the best information about science-based health literacy. In my current work, it's again, how do I reach my colleagues, both in the House and in the Senate, um, to help them better understand what value scientific literacy, science, thinking like a scientist, can bring to their lives, to bring to their analysis of legislation, to bring to their work in committees, because it's such important work, and also to help understand what their constituents are going through, and help them address the needs of their constituents. And when you're going to be talking about with policymakers, one thing that I've really realized is when policymakers use the word evidence, they don't necessarily mean scientific evidence, because there's legal evidence, which most policymakers are more comfortable with. Where, that, for example, testimonial evidence, which is in a part of the legal framework, means hearing from experts and then analyzing that expert view, which is very much a pattern that people utilize when they look at legislation or sit in committees. And that's has a tremendous cachet for when you hear from an expert. In science, the testimony of experts is at the bottom of our list of scientific evidence. This is the worst thing that we can actually look at, because we have this whole cascade, a whole pyramid of validating, and then we look at other things. We look at quality, we look at weighting of evidence, we look at risk of bias in evidence, all these other components that we do. And then when you come into the legislative discussions, that's not a construct that people are familiar with. And so again, when you're talking with legislators, you're going to need to know that where your audience is coming from and what your audience is doing. I'm just going to segue just very, very briefly, and hopefully we'll talk about this in the panels. When I was thinking about the question is, I communicate, you all communicate, but the question is who communicates about science to the public? And therein lies the rub. The most people who communicate to the public about science are members of the public. And they can communicate as well-informed members of the public, as uninformed members of the public, or as misinformed members of the public, and yet they all communicate to each other. And if you go on Twitter or anything like that, or Facebook or Instagram, and you can look at all this communication that's happening, much of it is misinformed or uninformed. So that's the one big issue. The other thing is persons with specific agendas. Not everybody that communicates doesn't have an agenda or wants to further the agenda of helping people understand. There are state actors who are deliberately trying to misinform and malinform. Okay, another word, malinform, actually to help destroy our democratic institutions. So they're trying to malinform the public. There are non-state actors who use disinformation to actually um, drive money into their pockets. Okay, the vaccines. If you take the vaccines, you'll get HIV/AIDS. But I have a product that if you have taken the vaccine and you take this pill, you won't get HIV/AIDS. See, it works, right? Because nobody has got HIV/AIDS from the vaccine after they've taken my pill. So that's the kind of thing. And then we also have state-related actors who are now weaponizing scientific disinformation, scientific misinformation, and malinformation for political purposes. And we can see that flourishing in our cousins to the south. And in fact, one of the most influential spreaders of scientific disinformation was President Trump. And his impact on the spread of disinformation during COVID has wreaked mayhem. But he was also a president who was interested in destroying the democratic institutions of our neighbor to the south. So we have this very complex interchange that's going on now, and scientists and science communicators are, in my opinion, going to have to play a huge role and a very much more important role in helping not just the general public have a better scientific literacy, a better health literacy, and a better way of improving their own lives, but also you are going to need to play a huge role in helping us preserve our democratic institutions. Because what I have seen happening with the rise of toxic populism is that scientific misinformation, malinformation is becoming weaponized in the political arena. You see this to the south of us hugely, very, very clearly. And your voice is going to be really necessary to both debunk this disinformation, but also pre-bunk this disinformation. And I just want to put on your agenda an organization called Science Up First. Some of you may know it. If you don't, please look them up and become part of that organization, which was created at the beginning of COVID to debunk a lot of this misinformation related around vaccines. So a very nice model for how scientists and science communicators can do that. So just look up Science Up First, there, and you'll find them. So thank you very much for having me with you and for raising a few issues for us to chew on and talk about.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we all have a really important role to play here, I think. And it's really interesting hearing you talk about like who is doing the science communication. When I was trying to put together those initial slides, it's kind of a hard thing to answer. We all are doing it all the time. And as you're saying, even people who know, very little about any of these topics are as well. So that interaction is really interesting, I think. And I'll move now into the panel section of this, and maybe we can start with.
No, it's I volunteer with some policy organizations, and one of them is doing a series on science policy and just different aspects of policy.
Thought that was a question. So maybe, yeah, I'll move to Amanda first to answer a question kind of from the science journalist perspective. Maybe you can explain to us a little bit more about how journalists actually choose what stories they focus on. So do scientists submit them to you? Are you seeking them out? How are you prioritizing these kinds of things?
Yeah, it's kind of all of the above. We get stories pitched to us. We get a lot of emails from different scientists just being like, hey, here's a study that I've got coming out. Also, the PR departments of universities send us a lot of pitches. We also seek out, every Monday. This morning, it was in my morning meeting where, I prepped by reading through Eureka Alert and reading through Nature News and reading through Science Mag and seeing what was coming out this week to see kind of what was going to be coming up in the news and seeing what was going to be going out. But a lot of times I get story ideas by talking to my friends and family, seeing what kind of sticky points exist out in society and seeing what people have questions about. And that's kind of, has sparked me to do certain pieces. Like, for example, one time I was just talking with a group of friends at kind of in the midpoint of the pandemic in like early 2021. And we were all talking about how bored we were and how we felt weird about being bored in the middle of a pandemic when we all have TV, we have Netflix, we have games, we have all this stuff to do. How could we be bored? And so I just decided to do an investigative piece kind of looking into boredom and what actually it is scientifically and why there seems to be this boredom epidemic going on. And so stories come from all over, but there's other factors at play besides just what's interesting when it comes to what we pick, right? That a lot of it has to do with timeliness. A lot of it has to do with what we've already covered on the show. We might have a black hole piece on the show. And then if another black hole story breaks, well, too bad. We can't, we don't want to have repeating topics kind of coming up. So it kind of varies week to week. And, sometimes timeliness and our desire to not repeat topics means that we miss out on really cool stories, but we always try and keep an open mind and stuff like that.
So I think a lot of us here are grad students, or have done grad school and that kind of thing. So how do you think scientists or, trainees and science journalists can work better together to communicate some of these important stories?
Yeah, it's tough. I think like the best thing that I ever did as a science journalist was sitting down with a group of scientists to kind of figure out how the sausage was made and to learn about the publishing process and how exactly, the funding process and how all of that works, because that helped to explain to me a lot about, the limitations that you guys have when it comes to talking about your work, when it comes, we can't break this embargo. We can't, we don't want to, our work was here. We don't want to talk about this over here. And like just talking about kind of the limitations of that. And similarly, I think that, scientists putting themselves in the journalist's shoes, right? Knowing that we're all on deadline and that a lot of times, like I'm lucky that I work for a dedicated science show, but a lot of news shows that try and cover science, those are just general interest journalists, and they're calling 20 people in a given day in the hopes that they can narrow down one story, from someone there. And so, have the information up front, know your work and know what your focus is and say, this is what makes my work cool, and be able to kind of pitch your work to us. It really is helpful in us kind of deciding on what to cover and what to do.
So I think something there, obviously we think our work is cool and it often is, but I think there's this balance between sort of being attention grabbing and also being truthful. And so how do you see that working into science communication, not overhyping a story or not kind of like overselling it, but also still gaining people's attention?
Yeah, that's a tough one because it really varies case by case. I'd say a lot more often of the time, I find people underselling their work. People are always like, oh, this isn't that interesting. It's just like this one little discovery that I made. And then once I pull a few threads and find out a bit more, then it's like, oh no, this is actually super interesting. Like your work is cool. Talk to me about it. Tell me about it. But overhyping is a problem. I've seen this many a times. And I think the best thing that scientists can do is just kind of be upfront with the limitations of your work. I discovered X, not Y, not Z. Please don't, don't take it in these far directions. I think journalists and scientists, it's a two-way street, and we both need to kind of work together, and all of us have our certain limitations. But I think if we're open and if we just say, look, this is my concern, And that happens a lot. People say, I don't want to talk about this. And they're so worried about telling me that they don't want to talk about this. So they're so worried that, that I'm going to be like, no, and hang up the phone and then turn away. But no, I want to know what you don't want to talk about, because then we don't go into that direction. So just be comfortable with kind of articulating the limitations of your work and articulating what it is that you're comfortable talking about and not comfortable talking about. That's totally fine. We can have that two-way relationship.
Cool. Okay, I'll move on to Senator Kuchar now and ask, so a lot of emphasis, I think, in what you're trying to do is really promote using evidence and having that influence decision-making. So can you tell us a little bit about right now how politicians and legislators are using evidence right now in their decision-making, and how maybe this can be done better?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. It's a difficult question to answer, because politicians are all so different, and they come from so many different backgrounds, and they come from all the way from basic scientists to people who spend their lives doing things that are completely different. So it's really important, because that there is the I think one of the things that is important to understand is that who the politician actually is. It's a real person, right? And how complex the political decision making is, and I think sometimes scientists and science communicators don't fully understand how complex that decision making is. So let me just spend a little bit of time unpeeling that a bit, because I think that you'll find that helpful. So for any politician, any person who is a parliamentarian, either in the House or in the Senate, they bring to that role a whole host of multiple pressures. And then they're slightly different between the House and the Senate, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. So if you're a member of Parliament, if you're an elected member of Parliament, what are some of the things that are pressuring you on every single legislative piece of legislation, every single discussion you have in committee, every single thing that you actually do in your job? So number one is the interests of your constituents. Okay, but also remember that your constituents aren't a single voice. That within your constituents, there are going to be multiple voices, hundreds sometimes, and many of them are competing with each other. Yes, we want you to do X. No, the last thing we want you to do is X, right? So that's right away that you can see that incredible complexity of that. The other thing is the role of your political party, because it may be that your political party has a platform or an ideology or a direction that it is wanting to go in. And it's and your because you are a member of a political party, that is also an influence and a pressure on you as a politician. Lobby groups, formal lobby groups, whenever there's a piece of legislation, lobby groups come because they're bringing particular perspectives that they want you as a parliamentarian to acknowledge, understand, and be aware of. And again, lobby groups come in all shapes and sizes. They have lots of different interests, and sometimes the interests compete with each other. So there you are as a human being, as a parliamentarian, trying to do your best, and you've got all these competing interests from the lobby groups coming. Then there are also personal and private factors. What has been your own life story? What's in your own knapsack? What do you bring to your job? What about your family members? So what life experiences have you had? What do you understand your life to be like, and what are the things that you bring from that to your current job? So that's all there. And then your own skill sets, particularly in cognitive and critical reasoning skill sets. And there's a huge variety there, and some of that depends on the discipline that you came from. So if you came from, if you're a constitutional lawyer, the skill sets that you bring to that decision making are rigorous and outstanding and very necessary. If you're a basic scientist, you bring a different set of skill sets to that conversation. If you're a marketing executive, you're bringing a different set of skill sets to that conversation. And when you get a whole group of parliament, to 360 some parliamentarians together, and you put them all together, and you can see the kind of crucible that all these different forces and pressures have. So the decision making has to take every one of these things into account.
Mm.
And that's why sometimes we say, oh my gosh, why don't they just listen to us? Because they are, but they're listening to a gazillion
Yeah.
other things.
Yeah, yeah. So what do you think, as someone who, was trained as a scientist physician, how do you think that has shaped your kind of perspective as a policymaker?
What it's really helped me to do is bring my critical scientific cognitive capacity to bear on the work that I do. So when I look at a piece of legislation, I can criticize the data. I can bring to it the data that I see in a very different lens. When I listen to witnesses at committees, I can ask them to show me the data that underlies their opinion.
Hmm.
And I can start to bring that kind of reasoning forward. And science is, again, people don't understand. Science is not a bunch of facts. Science is how you think critically about the world. All right, so it's trying to model and trying to encourage people to think critically, look at the data. How do we interpret that data? How does that help us become better legislators?
Yeah. Okay, so this is a question for
Just a
both of
quick,
you.
just a quick note, Don, if we could move to the final questions for our guests.
Yep. So a question for both of you. It seems that public trust in experts is eroding. So what do you think is a first major step needed to combat this? And obviously you guys are coming from two very different perspectives. So we're interested to hear kind of how you view this idea of public trust in experts. So maybe Amanda, if you want to start.
Oh man, this is a tough one. This is something we're constantly battling with, right? Because as Senator Kutcher has said, right, people are getting their information from everyone, and they choose where they get their information from to wherever it makes the most sense for them. And a lot of times that those are not driven by details. Those are driven by emotions, right? I want to know what's going on with COVID. Oh, it's actually a government conspiracy. Yeah, that makes me so angry. That explains why the world is blah, blah. So I actually don't have a full answer. All we can do is kind of meet people where they are and understand that emotions ultimately drive why people absorb certain information over others. And so, hearing people's fears, hearing people's concerns, and then gently countering those and not being like, well, you're an idiot because you're a conspiracy theorist. Like that never gets you anywhere. People put up walls the second they feel like you're insulting them. And instead just hearing their fears and gently countering them and, calming them even is kind of where we try and go. But obviously there's so much more research that needs to be done on how we can better equip people and better get the expertise back into the limelight and get people to trust experts again. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Senator Kutcher?
I would agree with what Amanda said, and I would add just two caveats for us to think about. Number one is we've always had segments of the population who's never trusted experts. This is not new. My grandmother used to put mustard plaster on me when I had a cold, and it was supposed to heal the cold. It did nothing of the kind. But the doctor would say to her, "Don't do that." She said, "Well, I'm still doing it." So we've always had this thing that people don't trust experts. I mean, and sometimes for good reason. So that's not new. What's new is the role of social media in amplifying this distrust. And so we know that false news travels way faster than truth does on social media. We know that when you add fear and falsehood together, you get a toxic mix. And so one of the things that I'm struggling with is how do we create structures where this new technology is amplifying and driving a lot of this distrust, disinformation, mistrust. How do we help understand how to regulate that technology so we'll go back to the usual levels of distrust that we have in our population? And I'm thinking through, how are we going to make sure that the algorithms are transparent? Because if you go down, if you just click on vaccine hesitancy. Eventually, after you click on a couple of all alternative views of vaccines, everything you click on takes you down the rabbit hole. And when you get down to the bottom of that rabbit hole, guess who's waiting down there? QAnon, InfoWars, BitChute, and then you get deluged with all this other stuff. The WHO is going to take over the world, right? So you get all that in there, and they all take you down that way. So one of the ways that we're thinking about is how do we help work with social media companies to help their algorithms be transparent? How do we get rid of all these bots or these factories that create information? Now, how do we differentiate malicious state actors like Russia from legitimate concerns? Because there's also a legitimate issue here around free speech. We have to be very, very careful that we support free speech, but free speech doesn't come without limits, and it doesn't come without responsibilities. So these are difficult issues. We need your help on these things.
Thank
If
you.
I can just, if I can just jump back in with one thing, like a big issue is that, if you Google vaccines, I want to know more about vaccines. Well, the New York Times article is behind a paywall. The Washington Post article is behind a paywall. The good information is all behind paywalls. And then the information that's like, it's going to give you AIDS, that's free. That's free of charge. And so many people are getting their information through Google these days. They don't want to pay for it. And well, that's how we end up with people believing in the boogeyman and believing in all of these conspiracy theories and not trusting the experts because they have to pay for the expert opinion, but they can get every other opinion for free. And so that's a problem on the journalism side. We know this. How do we get paid for what we do and the hard work that we do, while also just making sure that our information can get out there and is available? And part of that, like, we're the public broadcaster, so our stuff isn't behind a paywall, but people don't trust us either these days. Like, there's a huge component of people who don't trust us either. So yeah, how do we get around that? That's, again, something that we still really need to figure out and we really need to work on.
Thank you. Incredibly, incredibly interesting. I'm going to move now to a little bit of a break before the case study portion. So we're going to send out the case, a document that you can read now during just a quick 5-minute break for the case study that Senator Kuchar will be guiding us through. So we'll send that out now. And if we want to just meet back at 1:55 after you've kind of read through that a little bit, we will move into that section of the workshop. I think you'll see it in the chat being shared in 1 second. All right, if I can bring everyone back. We all had a chance to read through these interesting correspondence. Senator Kuchar, I'll pass it over to you if you'd like to work through some of these questions.
Oh, here we are. So these are just two of the thousands and thousands of emails I've received on these topics. These ones came recently. So I gave a number of questions, and maybe we could take, I don't know how to run this, Dawn. I'm happy to respond to that, but what's the process for having people identify themselves and give input?
Yeah, so I think if you want to work through some of the questions and people use the raise hand function to indicate that you'd like to speak, that's probably the best way. You can also write in the chat and I'll try to read those out as well. But I think the raise hand function will work
Okay,
well.
we can
call
do
on
that.
them.
So whoever has comments on the first question, which is identify key areas of concern expressed by the writer. So who has some insights into the key areas of concern?
Something I was noticing, obviously safety, health, big concern that keeps coming up.
Mm-hmm. Good points. Anything, anybody else sees areas of concern?
I mean, there seems to be a very significant distrust of government. And even as I'm seeing in the chat, Lori's mentioning this sort of fear of tyranny. It just really seems to be a strong distrust of government and institutions that's running through both the letters. Obviously, in particular, in the first letter, distrust specifically of certain politicians in Canada. And then the second, sort of a more broad fear of the WHO and its influence. But sort of, yeah, as Lori even is saying, this sort of fear of tyranny and fear of government seems to be a very significant part of this.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fair enough. Some of the issues, I would agree with what you said. Some of the issues that strike me here is the antipathy to what would be considered to be substantive rule of law based organizations and institutions whose purpose it is to try to create a society that improves the overall well-being and health of people. So it's underlying a lot of this stuff. We use the word distrust, but it goes more than just distrust. It's a real incredible antipathy to existing institutions by which we are governed, which we use to self-govern. It also underlies it is a incredible lack of knowledge, real ignorance about how institutions work, how these different organizations work with each other, what their roles are, how they function. So really, and the other thing that really underlies it is this visceral, this very strong, this is limbic system unleashed, visceral stuff. Someone just posted, we don't know about the task force. Yeah, nobody knows about this. Was just created. Somebody said, oh, there's this task force happening. Oh, in that case, let's jump all over it. I've actually spent some of my time down in those trenches. looking at what people are sharing with each other, and it is fractionally frightening. So that's some of the big pieces. So what kinds of disinformation or malinformation did you see in these case studies? What are the things that we saw?
Almost every sentence.
Yeah, there's actually not, and that's really good, Dawn. There's actually really nothing here that is actually true.
Yeah.
Okay, like just take any sentence and just and just state it. Okay, here, we're going to force people to have a mandatory vaccine, sending people to their homes to forcefully inject it into their bodies without informed consent. Huh? Who made that up? It's easy to laugh at this. This is no laughing matter.
Mhm.
No, and I think there's a comment here from Mary. She said that it's all fear and feelings, and I think that's exactly sort of how I felt as well. It's really emotional. It seems to be entirely driven by emotions. It doesn't seem to have a lot of other substance. I mean, I just feel the emotion coming through. I really agree with sort of what Mary has said in the chat.
Right. Yeah, Mary is right. It's just this incredible fear and falsehoods is coming together, this fear and falsehood component. You can see how powerful this is. And I'll tell you something, that when I get these kind of emails, I will get scores and scores and scores of them who have literally cut and pasted from each other. So it's not just one person sending me an email, it's a whole group of people who send these to each other constantly all the time. Okay, and so that this is an ever emerging voice. And if anyone is interested in the work that Frank Graves does in ECOS polling, you can look up the interesting overlaps of disinformation and the anti-vax, the pro-Russia, all those other kinds of components, and how they sit together, and what proportions of the Canadian population actually hold these ideas quite strongly. It's concerning. So how do you see then this information and malinformation being used to promote policy directions? If this is what people think should happen, how does that impact on policy directions? Well, this is one of the voices, right, that a parliamentarian is dealing with. These are people with legitimate concerns. This is what their concern is. And they legitimately bring this forward because they have a concern. So how are you going to deal with it? So I'd be really interesting to find out is how any of you here would actually respond to this correspondence.
So I think Caitlin perhaps has raised her hand if you'd like to.
Oh, I didn't see that.
comment.
Caitlin, thank you.
Hi, great discussion so far. I guess, I mean, it's a little bit difficult to say exactly how to address someone like this, but I think just providing them with like consistent sources of information. So, ideas and concepts the government is putting out consistently over time, and that there's not too much change. And obviously it's difficult with science and how things evolve, but trying to keep a consistent message of what is working, putting out numbers of how it's working and why. I think, some of the issues here are the shutdown is awful, it helps no one, but that just isn't true, right? The shutdown is important for certain people, sector societies. It is re-emphasizing kind of those points.
That's I think really a good observation, Caitlin. So the challenge here is how do we as a society pre-bunk this kind of information? It's one thing, because now that's come to me, I'm going to have to respond to it. That's a debunking, right?
Yeah.
How do we pre-bunk this information so that a wider range of the Canadian public gets that information from the wider, the expert component, you guys. How do we do that? Because as Amanda said, a lot of the people here don't trust mainstream media or will not look at mainstream media or see mainstream media as being part of the plot against them. So this is a really difficult question. I see Shauna has her hand raised.
I think that the way to get around this being before it gets to the point where people have bad information is to, when something is happening, like for example, the pandemic, or when new science news is being released to people that is going to affect a lot of Canadians, I think we have to get ahead of the problem and sit down with leaders from different communities so that, and give them evidence in the way that they know. So for example, you were saying earlier about how in Parliament, hearing an expert tell what they believe, like an expert opinion is really good evidence in law. So for example, like having the scientists sit down with leaders in different communities and explain and give evidence and show their proofs, so that the evidence can be coming from someone they trust already.
That's a good point. Thank you for that, Shauna. Any other suggestions, ideas people have?
So I'm seeing in the chat some themes. I'm not necessarily going to read everything, but I'm seeing in the chat some themes about sort of meeting folks where they are. I'm seeing a discussion about the importance of community groups, of specific community groups, and connecting and connecting with really sort of local groups as opposed to sort of having messages, I guess, being from on high. Yeah, and we're also sort of seeing a sort of similar to what, or sort of building off what Caitlin mentioned, the importance of messages that are, you know, quite concise and repeated over and over again, and sort of that folks have sort of that those facts sort of in their mind, and that they know those. These are some of the things that are being suggested. Someone also suggested, you know, the importance of social media as well, amongst other things. There's just a lot of chat moving, so I'm trying to keep track. So again, yeah, emphasizing community education, emphasizing again that in the vaccine engagement, that community ambassadors were important, sort of having that peer relationship with individuals as well, as opposed to you know, having folks who might be seen as being the elite or what have you. I think that they're sort of emphasizing the importance of peers as well. So it's just a few of the thoughts from the chat on this question.
Great. I see Lori has their hand up, her hand up.
Yeah, thank you for this. It's fascinating. Health literacy is an area that's of, special interest to me. What do you think about, I like the idea of community ambassadors, but what about the groups of people where there tends to be a higher level of, maybe I want to say, distrust? Or I think about like the wellness communities or naturopathic doctors. I know there's some controversies about certain groups like that, where maybe some of the messaging is perpetuated in a negative way, like, misinformation. I'm wondering if there are ways that maybe we can reach out to these groups somehow. I don't know exactly how, but I'm wondering what your thoughts might be on that.
Well, I think you raise a really important point, and before I engage with that issue, I just want to acknowledge Frank's summation is that there is no one single way to respond to this. It is multiple, it's complex, and it is consistent. You're constantly having to use every tool in your toolbox. And the tools keep changing over time, because the innovative criticisms that you see in these emails change over time. And these were both on the same week, but I can show you a thread of how all this changes over time, depending on what's in the news. the issue that Lori raised is from the wellness community. Look, we saw this happening before the pandemic. We saw the anti-vax movement and the wellness community coming together in profit-driven malinformation sharing, and it became a big part of it. And then we learned relatively recently that Russia, as a malevolent state actor, had started to target the anti-vaccine middle class, wealthy stay-at-home moms mostly, with the wellness messaging and trying to sow distrust in the science and distrust in the healthcare and distrust in the democratic system. So we saw actually before COVID hit this merging of wellness communities and anti-vaxxers and malicious state actors coming together with the purpose of raising mistrust in democratic and other kinds of institutions. So it's interesting. Part of the issue is what kind of health providers, what are the regulations around health providers, what's the role of the regulatory authorities around health providers. There's all sorts of really interesting material now. You can look at what has the chiropractic community, how have they addressed this issue? What about the naturopathic community? How have they addressed the issue? In medicine, there have been actual cases where the regulatory bodies have actually stepped in and said, physicians who are saying, you use ivermectin instead of getting a vaccine, we're going to put a stop to that. So these are hugely complex chains of response, and they require a whole of society response, because as Lori you pointed out, if it's only government that's making the response, it sort of feeds into the conspiracy, right? Or if it's only mainstream media that's making the response, it feeds back into the conspiracy again. So these are very, very complex issues.
So we'll need to move over to the next case in a moment, but just to wrap this up, what kind of response would you provide?
Oh, and thanks for asking that question, because on many of these, what I have done is choosing the ones that seemed less irrational and responding to them in a very thank you for raising this issue. This is an issue of some concern. I understand you're getting your information from these places, because sometimes they'll send you the links to the places. Have you considered looking at, and then I give them alternative pieces of information. And I've done that a number of times just to understand what I'm a scientist at heart. I want to experiment just to see what kind of response I get. And it's been fascinating. I've had some people who've engaged in a discussion with me. Okay, but that has been the vast minority. The most common response I get is vitriolic email back, mostly in capital letters, accusing me of being part of the World Economic Forum and wanting to destroy the world. Okay, that's the most common one I get back. So people hold these ideas very, very strongly, and even gentle engagement. Now, if you haven't read, people here haven't read the book by Katharine Hayhoe, who's a climate scientist. She talks how to talk about climate science with climate deniers. Anybody who's interested in science communication should really read her book. It's really very, very useful. But in that book, she says that there are a group of people that you cannot have the conversation with. Okay? So it's figuring out who can you have the conversation with, who is just so far down the rabbit hole that the issue is setting up guardrails instead of having a conversation. So those are very, very challenging issues and very, very important ones. So thank you very much for taking that. Yeah, that's Katharine Hayhoe is there. She's good. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is incredibly interesting and very, providing a lot of insight into what kind of stuff you're dealing with and sort of what's out there. So it's very, very interesting. And I'll now move over to Amanda for her case study portion.
I got it. Yeah, thank you so much, Senator Kutcher. And a lot of that is stuff that I relate to. Our inboxes are just full of emails similar to that. People asking us, why don't you interview Robert Malone, the inventor of mRNA, and why don't you do this? And you need to do this. And yeah, so I feel like we could have some great conversations about that for hours and hours. But I wanted to talk about not misinformation, but in general, just bad news, right? Because study after study shows that people tune out of bad news and they don't want to hear it. So for example, in my early days at Discovery Channel, we used to collect viewership data minute by minute to see who was watching the show, when did they tune in and when did they tune out. And always, without fail, the second we started mentioning climate change, boo, people tuned out. They did not want to hear what was going on with climate change. And this was in the early 2010s. And so I think things have changed a little bit, but we were really trying to say, this is coming down the pipeline, guys. You should listen, you should listen, you should listen. And no one wanted to listen. And I don't want to say that's the audience's fault. That's our fault. We're the communicators. Our job is to get people to care, get people to be interested in these stories in order to absorb them and then spread that amongst their communities. And so for this case study, I wanted us all to kind of work together to figure out how to cover bad news. And so in particular, the latest IPCC report. So there's a link that if you guys could post this out there, great, thank you. So these are two things about the IPCC report. Maybe you saw the news come out about it. Basically, the intergovernmental panel on climate change. It's a bunch of scientists from around the world who come together to put together these massive reports that look at the science and say, where are we at when it comes to climate change? And this particular report that came out earlier this year came with grim warnings for the future. It said climate change will be worse than expected. Basically, we're all doomed. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called it an atlas of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership. That is hard. That is hard to absorb. And so my question for you guys is, first off, do you cover it? Do you think that this should be front page reports, or do you think that, if we do that, then people just tune out and that sort of thing? So if we have a poll here, you guys said, yeah. Do you guys think that we should even tell people about this report? Do you think that this is news? Or do you think that this is just like, people can't do anything about it, so why not? Do we want to bum people out? Okay, I see. Obviously, yes, you guys all agree. You're coming in. That's great. Awesome. Just wanted to see if we had any dissenters among the group. So yes, obviously, we decided to cover it. We feel that it's important that people know what's going on with climate change and that people know even the bad news about it. Now, do you guys have any thoughts as to why someone might not want to cover this sort of report? If you guys have any thoughts, you can just post in the chat, or you can even just chime in, raise your hand. If not, that's fine. I will continue to explain our reasoning at least. So for us, yeah, obviously we wanted to talk about this report because even though we know that people don't like to hear it, we really want to make sure that the information is out there. And so again, this comes back to what I was saying earlier about storytelling. We decided to tailor our response on our show about the hope in this report, because yes, it was all doom and gloom, but they had different ideas about adaptations and saying this is what's actually working in terms of adapting to climate change. We can't prevent it at this point. It's happening. The climate is changing. It's here. These are curious ways that we're adapting to it. So we thought that was really interesting. But there were other parts of the report as well. So this report looked at impacts of climate change, as well as adaptation methods that could work, and as well as areas of the world that are particularly vulnerable to climate change. So I guess my second poll question is, like, what do you guys think? What would you focus on if you were covering this? Do you think that the impacts of climate change are what's important? Do you think that we should look at how we can adapt to it? Or do you think we should actually focus on looking at the areas that are particularly vulnerable and try and get people to care about that? And like, really, there's no wrong answers here, right? Like, all of these are worthwhile. All of these are things that scientists spent months, if not years, working on, studying, researching, fact checking, gathering all this information. I think the impacts thing it's one of those things where man, we've been hit over the head with the impacts of climate change. We know that the oceans are warming. We know that, you know, now we're getting worse storms. We know all of this stuff, or at least a lot of people know about this stuff. This, you know, we're seeing it more and more as this is happening. But the other issue that we run into is that it's really hard to say, oh, that bad storm that we had the other week where it, you know, knocked out power in Ottawa and we had all the different, like the crazy thunderstorm, yes, that is climate change related 100%. We can't absolutely confirm anything until years down the line. So it's really challenging for us to really be certain about that. But what is good to talk about, what gets people to care, again, is the stories, the people. Here are the people who are affected by this, and we know that this is because of climate change. It is something that has been very difficult for general news, not science news, but like general news. We've had a lot of issues when it comes to even saying the words climate change. I think there was a report that came out last year that looked at, you know, any general news reports across Canada of bad weather, and like only 3 of them mentioned that it was because of climate change, or that climate change could have been an influence on it, when we know that it is actually becoming more and more likely that we are seeing the weird weather that we're getting, the polar vortexes and hurricanes and weird, all of that stuff is becoming more and more likely because of climate change. So it looks like we've got, you know, mixed bag, but a lot of you guys agree with me. Thank you, that we should talk about adaptation and things that we can do. Another question that I'd love to ask you guys is that there's a very vocal group that says that this report is completely wrong. It's all made up, and that this is bunk science, and that we don't agree with it, and we think that this is terrible stuff. Should we include the voices of the opposing side when it comes to climate change? So there's the next poll. What do you guys think? All right, okay. We've got a mix, we got some no's, we got a lot of yeses. That's very interesting. All right, now I'm hoping some of the people who said yes and some of the people who said no, I'm hoping that you guys want to chime in and kind of explain why you chose that answer. Is there anyone who wants to chime in? If we can make it so that even people can share it in the chat, that would be great. Oh, Shauna, I see Shauna's got.
Sure, why not? I'll give it a go. I said yes because I think that if if we can say this is what other people are saying, but this is where their evidence came from, and this is where our evidence came from, and for these reasons, we choose to believe this because we have this evidence to back it up, and this is where that came from, and that was just a guy that said so, you know, then it gets out in front of them hearing a dissenting voice later and being like, I don't know which one to choose. I'll just pick whichever one I want.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a great point. And I see, in the chat, we've got, Mary saying it's conducive to having a conversation. It's important to address the misconceptions from the other side. You're only otherwise having a conversation with yourself and make the report more neutral. I mean, those are all valid points. And we do sometimes, you know, we'll always toss the climate scientist a question and be like, well, what do you say? Like, what do you think about this? Or like, here's an issue that has come up. What do you think? But the misinformation, though, as Senator Kutcher was saying, like a lot of times it's not rooted in any fact. It's, you know, it's, oh, this is coming from a government conspiracy to take all of our money and to completely debunk our economy and spend all of this money on getting rid of fossil fuels, and that's actually coming from China because they want us to cripple our economy and they want us to be poor, and so all this stuff. And like we struggle with that a lot, because how do you debunk something like that? Why do we have so few precious moments of airtime? How do we, devote it to saying that someone's wrong and to highlighting someone and saying that they're wrong? But as you guys are saying, we're not going to be converting anyone, but it's hard. This is something that we're constantly debating with. So that's why I wanted to get you guys and your opinions on that. Let me see. I'm sorry. I'm just reading the questions in the chat. Yeah, so a lot of times we do end up doing separate articles that just debunk and say this is what you need to know about XYZ, about the IPCC report. A lot of times CBC will put out a separate article and just be like, this is what people are saying, this is what the report says. This is not what the report says, but this is what's actually going out there. And these are some of the facts and stuff that's coming out. What we just don't want to do is justify it, because oftentimes all people will need is a 10-second clip of our host even saying the conspiracy theory, and they'll take that and then they'll be like, see, it's right, Bob McDonald talked about it, see, it's right, it was on CBC. And so yeah, this is something that we're constantly grappling with, especially when it comes to bad news, because people are always looking for a boogeyman to blame for the bad news as opposed to real things. But on the flip side, one of the things that we are also getting better at as journalists in total is identifying that climate change is not going to be solved by us switching out plastic straws. Like, that's not a thing that's going to help. That has, individuals what we need is collective action. What we need is policy. What we need is, to actually look at this sort of thing. And so our job has kind of shifted from just talking about climate change to really pushing and identifying the true sources, fossil fuels, we know this, and really pushing that science and making sure that that's well known, or as well known as our listeners can take it. Do you guys have any thoughts, issues, questions, comments, concerns at this point? I see lots of stuff going on in the chat. So one thing that I would love to say, so first off, there's a link to an ombudsman report. If you guys can share that in the chat, if someone can share that. So every time we talk about climate change on our show, we get complaints from people saying, how dare you not talk to the other side? How dare you not talk to the scientists that say that this is bunk and that climate change is a hoax and that it's not really happening. So we do get these reports, and we're for like that at that point when it goes to the ombudsman, the CBC ombudsman, that's when we are for it. We have to reply because they've escalated it to a certain point. And you can kind of see our justification for not always including the other side in this report if you want to see that. Ultimately, it's that we go based on consensus. We cannot present, yes, climate change is real, no, climate change is not real, as a 50-50 solution or as a 50-50 option, because that's not the case. It is 99% of scientists agree climate change is happening and it's human caused. 99%. And that is actually documented. There was a scientific study done last year that did a meta study of 15,000 scientific reports out there and found that 99% of them said climate change is real, human caused, fossil fuels, this is the cause. So the 1%, is that something we pay attention to? Again, that's not something that we feel that we should do on a regular basis, just because, we're going based on the consensus here. And so, yeah, so at Discovery Channel, when we had that meeting showing that people tuned out of climate change talk, we didn't want to not talk about it, even though some of our bosses were like, okay, great, we don't talk about climate change anymore. We gotta keep the audience interested. But a lot of us kind of banded together and said, no, like, let's actually figure out how we can cover it and how to care. And so Senator Kutcher mentioned Catherine Hayhoe. Her work is great. There's another climate psychologist. His name is Per Espen Stoknes, and he has some incredible suggestions on how to frame conversations about climate change. And yes, that's his job title. He's a climate psychologist. And so his big thing is, don't just focus on the doom and the despair, because it's not hopeless. There's actually a lot of hope out there about climate change. People care way more today about the climate than they did 10 years ago. And that's great. We just have to keep it going. We fixed the ozone hole, right? We have success stories about how the planet banded together to stop doing bad things. So let's focus on that. Let's focus on the hope and stop listening to the misinformation campaigns designed to shift the focus away from the real culprits. And what we need to do is instead just band together and point out the actual solutions that people can do, because that's how you prevent people from feeling hopeless. Another suggestion that Dr. Stoknes had was to frame fixing climate change as an opportunity. We can get so many jobs in the green energy sector. We can get a stronger and a more dependable economy. We can have all these fantastic technological advances, and he boasts Tesla as being one of them. There's just so many cool opportunities coming up that we won't even miss fossil fuels. They're a thing of the past. They're old. Like we have all this cool new stuff coming down the pipeline. So let's focus on those, promote those, talk about those. And one final point is, he says, to make it about health. Climate change is bad for your health, right? Like when I was growing up in Toronto, every summer we had smog days and we were struggling to breathe on these smog days. But since we shut down all the coal plants, I actually don't remember the last smog day that we had. That's great. We did the thing. We fixed it. And that focuses on your health. And so clean air, clean water, those are essential to good health. And so, you know, if you don't want to lobby your government to stop burning fossil fuels and do all that, you do it for clean air, do it for clean water. And that's another way that we get through, you guys were talking about the wellness community, for example. Like, what do they care about first and foremost? Their health, right? They're the heroes of their own story. Their goal number one is their health. So let's focus on health. If you want to reach those people, talk about health, talk about what makes them worried, and deal with those and take their worries, and then, you know, use that to get them to care. So that's it for my case study. Do you guys have any questions?
Thank you so much. That was very, very interesting. Again, both of these case studies are incredible at giving us like kind of these real life examples to work through. So thank you both so much for that. We're at 2:30 now, so this is the end of our workshop. I think we could keep talking about all these things for a very long time, but I will thank Amanda and Senator Kuchar. Thank you so much for joining us and providing a lot of important information and your insights to us. And also thank you to everyone who attended. We hope you enjoyed it. We also hope you attend our last workshop of the series. And I think if you have any further questions, please forward them to us at TSPN, and we can try to manage them that way. Is there anything else, Frank, to mention before we close?
No, that's all. So if you do have any questions, so just to obviously respect our speakers' time, you can send them to us, and we can perhaps curate a few to send to them. And finally, just as a point of just organization, we will be letting folks know about our attendance incentives by email in the next few days. And of course, yes, encourage strongly folks to come join us on June 14th at around lunchtime again for our final workshop in the series to be focused on science for policy and evidence-informed decision-making. So thank you very much, everyone. And of course, a huge thank you to our experts today.
This has been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot. All the best.
Thanks so much.
Ciao.